A year ago, I met with Bernard Ashley, who as a primary school teacher began writing books and became the award-winning author that he is today. We originally filmed an interview with Bernard here in Wapping, but the weather was so bad that we decided to film it back at his house. Bernard's father was a firefighter in World War II. At the time, he was too old to fight, so this was his way of contributing to the war effort.
We're Londoners. My dad was in the fire service locally here in South London, in Plumstead. My father volunteered to do training as an auxiliary fireman in the evenings in, I would say, the middle to the late 30s. People knew a war was coming and people were preparing for it. And he went and did evening sessions, doing the training as an auxiliary fireperson. When the war began, the auxiliaries became national, so instead of lots of different fire brigades around the country, it was nationalised, and he was part of the National Fire Service. But that was something he did, and I think people were doing lots of other sorts of things because Britain knew it was going to be going to war. And he was too old, I think, for active service. He was too old to be called up to go and be a soldier or a sailor or an airman.
Bernard remembers normal bedtimes were at the air raid shelter. It was a cool, dry space with 4 bunks for him and his family.
Our air raid shelter was bone dry, and my mother, we had 4 bunks in it, and my brother and I slept on the top bunk on one side. My brother slept on the bottom bunk on the other side. My mother slept on the top bunk on that side. And when my dad was off watch, because he was a local fireman and he had a night at home, he came in and slept on one of the boys' bunks, and the parents were on top and the boys were underneath.
He described how his treasured possessions were a torch, some toy cars and soldiers, and some books.
So in the air raid shelter, I had my torch, and I had my dinky toy cars, and some toy soldiers, and a book or two, just on the little shelf where I slept. We'd got an oil stove in the middle of the shelter, so it was warm, and we had a blackout curtain across the front of it, and we felt pretty safe. And my dad had said, "Don't be frightened." He said, "If a bomb hits our house and you're in the air raid shelter, okay, the house might fall on the shelter, but the shelter will withstand that and they'll dig you out." And then he said, "And the chances of a bomb hitting our shelter direct, ours, out of all of London," he said, "you know, we'll be all right." So I was never frightened.
His dad never spoke of his own experiences as a firefighter, and Bernard didn't tend to ask. He said that the experience had been so traumatic for everybody that they simply didn't discuss it.
Never. Never. No. No. That was a completely... we weren't aware that he was being secretive or protective. We just never talked about it. He never talked about it, and neither did we.
Not even after?
We didn't ask him about it or anything.
Not even after the war?
No.
Never?
No. No. The war had been so traumatic for everybody. He didn't want to dwell on it. Yeah. We were all in it, or we were all under it, and he had to be out in it and fighting the fires and in the docks and everything, and he was injured in the docks, and eventually he was allowed to join us where we were evacuated in Preston to come up while his injuries got better. But no, he did what he had. I don't think it's easy to explain. The war was going on. It was all around us and happening all the time, so it wasn't something we talked about.
Bernard talked of his good friend Donald Lush. He described how one day, when walking to school, he'd forgotten his dinner money.
In a way, it's a tribute, and I'll mention his name. I had a good friend called Donald Lush, L-U-S-H. And he was a good friend. And I remember one day, it was a Monday, because it was the day we took our dinner money for a school dinner. And I met him at the top of my road, and as we did, and we walked along to the school gate, and I just said to Donald, I said, being Monday, I said, oh, got your dinner money, Donald? Oh, he said, no, I'll blow. And he ran home to get it. He said, it won't be long. And he chased off home so he could go home, get his dinner money and come back in time to go in when the bell went. And while he was in his house, a V2 rocket came over and demolished it, and houses all on either side. And I often think, if only I hadn't said to Donald, have you got your dinner money? He might not have run back to get it. He might have gone into school, and that rocket would have, his mum was killed. And his dad was a fireman who worked with my dad. So we knew very much how awful that was.
One of his books, set in East London in World War II, tells the story of a group of young people who decided they had a role to play in the war effort. This book is an incredible read, telling the story of a group of brave, courageous young people who, shocked at the lack of resources, decided to form their own group of firefighters. They found their own tools, gear and equipment, so that when other people were fleeing the bombs, they stayed behind to rescue people in their homes. But what if this wasn't a fiction book? What if this was a true story? What if young people really put their lives in danger for the good of others? The Dead End Kids were a real group of kids from the East End. They really did put together a team of young people to help stop fires and save others.
I was at BAFTA with Anna one day, and she said, I've read a story that I think is a Bernard Ashley story, and it's about these boys who started their own juvenile fire brigade in London in the war. She said, it's a true story. And she said, I think you might be interested in it. So I started researching it from there, and finally came to actually write my story of it, which is fiction, but in the writing of it, got very interested in what those Dead End Kids did. So I read about Patsy Duggan, who was the boy who really did start the real Dead End Kids. And he had a sister called Maureen Duggan. And in writing about it, and I was obviously very interested in the boys in it, but I was also very interested in Maureen Duggan, not as a character, but not as a character as I would finally write her, but as an idea that there was a girl who was also very, very much involved in the whole thing. So that's why I concentrated in my book on her, or on the female character, who is not Maureen Duggan, I've got to stress, but is my female character. The Dead End Kids themselves realised that the fire brigade was under enormous stress. Yes, they'd called in fire brigades from outside London to come and supplement the London docks, but there still weren't enough of them. And seeing that there were fires burning that weren't being put out, they decided, and under the leadership of the boy Duggan, they decided that they would set up their own fire brigade and do what they could in their own way. So although they couldn't put out and they couldn't attend unexploded bombs, they could get stirrup pumps and buckets of water and buckets of sand and wheelbarrows and go-karts, and they could run and put out fires where they saw them. And they organised themselves sufficiently that they would put a boy on the top of Watson's Wharf, and obviously they were rotated and so on and so forth. And when a bomb fell and the fire wasn't put out straight away or whatever, a lookout on the top of Watson's Wharf would shout down and say where they had to go. And people like Patsy Duggan organised the crews of 4 or 5 who went off with their wheelbarrows and their go-karts to go and put those fires out.
What has emotionally touched you the most about them? The real Dead End Kids?
Well, I think the fact that there were deaths. I think the fact that they wanted to do it and they did it. And the fact that they did it well. What they did was really, really something remarkable. And they just took their name from an American film series that was shown sometimes on Saturdays called The Dead End Kids. And so they took that as their name. And because they were East End kids, they called themselves the Dead End Kids. Mind you, the boy who organised it, he wasn't a boy, he was a man. He was 14. He'd left school and was a young docker. So today we think of him as being a kid, but he was actually a working man because people left school at 14 and were at work. I mean, I've researched as much as I can. I can't, I've not been able to tap into anyone's diaries or they probably weren't the sort of people who kept diaries and so on and so forth. So what we've got is, I suppose, common or public knowledge of them from people who have managed to research what they can. But in a way, it's a question of born, did this, died. You know, I mean, the details aren't very strong.
One building, burning furiously, contained about 30 horses. Young Ronnie Ayres led a section in to release them and lead them to safety. It was a big job, and other sections were told to go in and help. They got every horse out and led the lot to safety. The horses whinnied and blew and plunged, but they trusted those boys and went through the fire with them. Ronnie came back with his section looking for more worlds to conquer. The clothes of some of those boys were smouldering. The kids' sections were moved here and there by their veteran young commander. Ronnie's section was running towards some houses on which a load of incendiaries had just fallen when 3 very heavy bombs came down almost beside them. Ronnie Ayres and Bert Eden were killed almost instantaneously, and another boy was badly wounded. Patsy Duggan himself was also wounded, but carried on. They carried Ronnie Ayres back to his home, and whilst his body lay there, his notice to join the RAF arrived. He had been longing for it to come, but when it came, he was already called to a higher service. Ronnie Ayres had celebrated his 18th birthday a day or two before. He was the youngest of 6 boys. There were also 2 sisters.